My mother-in-law's entitled ex-boss crashed her funeral. My mother-in-law was unalived last Christmas Eve in a street robbery gone wrong. It was so sudden, and when we got the news, my husband and I were scrambling to find our way up there because she lived across the country from us. Because of this, we weren't able to be a part of the funeral planning, but thankfully made it up there the day before with the help of his best friend. The viewing and the funeral were the same day, so as we walked into the funeral home, my husband noticed her ex-boss. Her ex-boss was Greg, that's his real name, F. Greg. She worked with him for the county and paid bills for different social service organizations and was the go-between for CPS. This man was so useless and she hated him with a passion. He was always weird and tried making advancements towards her. He would call her his work wife and joke that he couldn't do anything without her. And he couldn't. She was doing both her and his job. She even built the database that the entire county uses to track all of the money spent on the various bills. After she left, the secretary that replaced her ended up getting Greg fired because she quickly found out that he couldn't do his job because my mother-in-law had been doing it for him. Oh, and he threatened to rope the new secretary. My mother-in-law worked for him during the 00s when my husband was in high school. During this time her husband, my father-in-law, was diagnosed with cancer. He battled it for years, but eventually he passed away from it. The only reason my mother-in-law put up with Greg's crap in the job was because she needed the health insurance for her husband's chemo since he couldn't work. Which Greg took full advantage of because he knew she couldn't afford to lose her job. During the times he fought and she had to take off work to care for him, Greg would send her home with work because he couldn't do any of it himself. Her husband was dying from cancer and he was still sucking every last drop of work out of her he could. He was and is still a very crappy person. So fast forward to the funeral. She hadn't worked for him in 6 years, and to see him there was just a slap to the face. First came the hearse, where only the closest living relatives were following it. Since my husband was an only child and his father had already passed, he was the closest living relative. She did have 3 brothers, so they followed in the car behind ours. Then her cousin, then everyone else. As we are all making our way to the cemetery, I see someone cut in front of her brothers. I turn around and lo and behold, it's her ex-boss. I was ticked. He then tried to cut in front of us. And I thought it couldn't get worse, but it did. So since we couldn't make it up there until the day before the funeral, we didn't have a say in the preacher who did her eulogy. The preacher did a terrible job. He stumbled on his words, he put no effort into it, and obviously didn't know anything about her. But after he spoke, before my husband gets a chance to stand up and speak about her, effing Greg gets up. He starts talking about Maria and all the work that she did working for him and how she did everything and she was his work wife. And he talked at length about his work with the county and how they helped the community and just kept patting himself on the back. But the mother effing icing on the cake was he said that her work for him, when my husband was a teenager, directly inspired her to adopt my husband from Paraguay when he was a baby. He is so self-absorbed that he thinks that what he does is so important that it inspired her to adopt 15 years earlier? I was squeezing my husband's hand so hard during all this that I was about to break it. My husband and Greg got into a fist fight at the end. However, Greg is now hospitalized.